The opportunity to c-bet the flop is one of the most common nodes in poker, so learning where we should deviate from GTO strategy to exploit our opponents can significantly improve our win rate. So in this video, I'm going to use node locking in GTO Wizard to explore how our flop c-bet strategy should change based on the tendencies of our opponents. Specifically, the tendencies I want to focus on are, first, how often they fold to flop c-bets, second, how often they check raise the flop, and third, on boards where they should have donk bets, how often are they actually donk betting the flop. And at the end of the video, I will recap the main takeaways and outline some simple heuristics we can use to make exploitative flop c-betting easier to implement in real games. So let's just get into it. The first spot that I have pulled up is a button versus big blind spot on King Queen 7 Rainbow, and so button raised pre and big blind defended. And on this flop, we can see that big blind is pure checking, and button's optimal strategy is to go B67 at around 55% frequency. This is a relatively polar range. You see that we're usually, c-betting our super strong stuff, and then we have some bluffs in here, and then we are checking back a lot of these pairs and a lot of these 7x. So sort of a standard strategy to use when we're playing a B67 size. And now let's take a look at big blind's optimal response against our c-bet. So if we look at their response, there is a small amount of raising, and they are folding around 48.6% of the time, which happens to be around the global average for fold to flop c-bet spots. Obviously against smaller bet sizes and or when big blind has less of a range disadvantage, this number will be a lot lower. And against larger sizes and when in position has even more of a range advantage, big blind should be folding significantly more than this. But let's adjust this in a few different ways to sort of see how we should change our c-betting strategy as the button in this situation. First, maybe let's take a look at a very extreme example where big blind is just folding their entire range. I would guess what would happen in this situation is that our betting frequency should go way up, but we'll probably still check with our super nutted hands because they can make more money by allowing for play on future streets. So let's node lock for this and go back to see what our betting range looks like in the button. Okay, so our betting frequency went up from around 55% all the way to 95%, and the only combos that we are pure checking now are the sets. So even, some very strong combos like ace king and king queen still prefer to bet because when our opponent folds, we win 100% of the pot, whereas obviously even with these strong hands, we do not have 100% equity against our opponent's range. And so the guarantee of denying equity seems to be worth it once we get below a certain equity threshold of maybe around 90% or so. Whereas sets here are going to have closer to 95% equity against big blind's range. So they do prefer to check back to try to get more money in on future streets and don't really care about denying equity. So this actually is somewhat surprising to me. And the thing that's surprising is how valuable equity denial actually is. Because again, even a hand like king queen apparently prefers to bet, most of the time at least, and just win 100% of the pot here. So that's good to keep in mind and potentially foreshadowing that most deviations that we are likely to make does not necessarily come from the value region of our c-betting range. Okay, now let's take a look at sort of the opposite situation and node lock for if big blind never folds. And let's see what happens to our c-betting strategy as the button in that hypothetical situation. So now let's take a look at our c-betting strategy as the button. And once again, it increases dramatically from GTO, but in this case, instead of it being a polar range, it's obviously a perfectly merged range, since if they're never folding, and given that they're also very rarely raising, we should basically be betting anything that pushes equity against villain's actual range, since, they're calling with their whole range. So we went from betting polar when villain responds appropriately to betting like bottom 90% of hands when they always fold to betting the top 80% of hands when they never fold. So obviously these are extreme hypothetical situations that are not very realistic, but I do think understanding the fundamentals is sort of a good baseline for the framework that we can flesh out with more realistic tendencies. So let's play around a little bit more to see how our strategy does change with more realistic tendencies. Again, this is our original GTO 55% polar c-betting range. And now let's see what happens if our opponent folds like 58% instead of 48%. And let's keep their raising frequency at around 3% so that that does not sort of change anything else. Okay, so now they're folding 58%. And again, if we look at our c-betting range again, here it goes way up and we are still betting polar, but just at a much, much higher frequency from 55% to 84%. So I think a good takeaway here is that even a relatively small increase in out of position's folding frequency should impact our betting frequency by quite a lot. And again, we are pure betting our value, including most of our sets here, since they are not pure folding, they're just folding slightly more. And so we still do want to be pushing equity, but we obviously get to include a lot more air since our opponent is overfolding. However, again, it is still polar and we are still checking back our weak queen X and our pairs 8s through jacks and that kind of thing. So I think this is a good change to sort of try to internalize, just realize how much more frequently we can be betting with air against an opponent who folds, 10% more often than they should against flop c-bets. And of course, again, assuming that they're not raising at any significant frequency, which we will get into in a little bit. But yeah, now let's see what happens if they don't fold as often as they should. So now instead of folding 48%, let's say they're only folding 38%, again, keeping the raising frequency around 3. And here finally we get to a situation where we should reduce our betting frequency. What I think is important here is that our value range doesn't change very much. We're still betting our clear value hands, but we do greatly reduce the frequency with which we bet like our ace-3 through ace-6 combos, stuff like 9-5 suited, which, we're betting at a higher frequency against a GTO opponent in the big blind. We are more likely to check back when our opponent does not fold as much. And so this obviously makes sense. We reduce our betting frequency and mostly just take out a bunch of air. And we are still betting some bluffs since we do still have some fold equity and we want board coverage as well as bluff combos on various runouts. But again, it makes sense to reduce our bluffing frequency with our already polar range when villain is not folding as much. So hopefully all that makes sense. And now let's dive into a different spot and focus more on how big blind's check raising strategies should influence our c-betting strategies. So here I have another button versus big blind spot, and the board is 8-8 deuce two-tone. Here big blind should basically pure check, and we as the button should be c-betting for b25 at around 77% frequency. So if we take a look at big blind's response against our c-bet, they should actually be raising a lot at 38.5% for a small raise and, calling 23%, folding 38%. But here I want to focus specifically on what happens if big blind deviates from their optimal 38.5% check raise frequency on this board. So first, let's node lock and have them raising at, let's say, 50% instead of 38, which is, a significant increase in a raising frequency. And here we actually c-bet slightly more often. And in fact, in this spot specifically, I would think that if we node lock for, let's just say they're raising 80%-ish, or 56%, whatever. So yeah, our c-betting frequency actually goes up. And I think this is specifically because since big blind is already supposed to be raising the vast majority of their nutted combos on this board, when we force them to raise more, their raising range automatically becomes weaker. And so we get to bet more often for that reason. And So I assume that against a raise, we will have like a pretty decent 3-bet frequency at 33% here. So this is interesting to see, but we should be aware that this correlation is the opposite on boards where out of position starts off with a low raising frequency and then we increase it by a bit. But for now, let's stick with this board and take a look at what happens if big blind is only raising 20% of the time. Okay, so here we basically just range bet. Since out of position is not raising as much as they should be, denying and realizing equity with all of our bets becomes more likely. So in this kind of spot where big blind should be raising with the vast majority of their strong hands and has a significant raising range, we actually c-bet more frequently when villain is off with their frequency in either direction. And so this makes it a pretty safe exploit in softer games to increase our c-bet frequency in spots like this, since it's unlikely that out of position is going to perfectly nail their raising range and raising frequency. So I think that's a pretty cool takeaway for these sorts of spots. But again, remember, there are other boards. Like let's take a look at the King Queen 7 again, where our optimal c-bet frequency is 55%. But here, if we increase out of position raising frequency from 3 to let's say like 10%, and now we can see they're starting to raise a bunch of combos that they were previously calling, like top 2 pair, pocket sevens most of the time, stuff like this. Now our c-betting frequency actually went down. And so we do need to be conscious of how out of position's raising range is constructed. And if they're raising more frequently than GTO, but including more strong combos, then we should c-bet less often. But again, if they should already be raising a bunch of their strong combos, then we can actually be c-betting more often, whether they're raising more or less often than GTO. So hopefully that wasn't too hard to follow. And again, we'll sort of recap some takeaways at the end. But for now, let's take a look at a couple flops where out of position should get a donk betting range and find some exploits in those situations. So the first of these donk betting situations I want to take a look at is hijack versus big blind on 6-3 deuce rainbow. And the reason I chose this spot is because this is a board where the big blind should have both the offsuit combos of the straight and some of the suited combos, whereas in position has none of the offsuit combos and not very many of the suited combos. Since big blind has a clear top of range advantage, they should have a donking frequency at 37.5%. And when they check, we should be c-betting as the hijack for B40 around half the time. So we should be c-betting, queens plus a good amount of the time, although checking back sometimes as well, pure c-betting our sets, and, sort of mixing in some gut shots and things with overcards, checking back a lot of our broadways. A somewhat standard 50% frequency c-bet range. Now let's take a look at what happens when we remove big blind's option to donk bet. Here, the exploit to this is literally just to check back our entire range and never c-bet. And this is a pretty common mistake that players are going to make out of the big blind, especially if you see someone snap check on this flop. That likely indicates that they didn't even consider donk betting, which likely means that they don't have a donk betting range. And when that's the case, we should check back our entire range, including all of our sets and all of our overpairs, and again, just literally everything. We can take a look at what would happen if we changed our size to B40, but first let's look at our pot share for pure checking here. It's 46.7%. So even if we change our bet size to B40, first of all, our optimal frequency for betting is only 9%, which again is way, way lower than 50%, but our pot share stays exactly the same. And so I do think by far the best strategy to use, just because it's easier to implement and still maximally exploits our opponent, is to check 100% of our range here. So this is certainly a valuable exploit. Let's change the board a bit though, and take a look at a 7-4-3 two-tone board. This is a board where out of position still has the offsuit straights and some of the suited straights, but in position is going to basically pure have the suited straight, since hijack is always opening 6-5 suited preflop, but not always 5-4 suited preflop. Once again, big blind should have a pretty healthy donking frequency at 32.5%, and when they check, we should be c-betting around 52% for B40 again. Again, pretty often betting queens plus, although sometimes checking. And yeah, you can kind of take a look at what the betting range looks like here. And here, if we remove big blind's ability to donk bet, as the hijack, we should still be betting for B40 at 29%, which is significantly less than the 50% frequency we were betting prior. And again, you see now we're checking most of our overpairs, checking sets even a good amount of the time, and just, again, betting a lot less in general. So when out of position should have a somewhat significant donking frequency and they never donk, the way to exploit that is by checking more frequently as in position. And in extreme cases where big blind has a lot more straights than we do, then we can just pure check. And in slightly less extreme situations, where we still have at least all of the suited straights, then we can still have a betting frequency, but it should be a lot lower. So again, some good takeaways there. And these were the main spots I wanted to look at in Wizard today. So now let's recap what we've learned throughout this session. Okay, so first of all, I didn't mention this before, but using a HUD is of course the best way to know what your opponent's tendencies are. And if you want to check out Hand to Note, there is a link in the description for 10% off. But anyway, here's a recap of what we've learned. First off, denying equity is quite valuable even with strong hands. And there are still situations where we want to exploitatively check back super strong hands, but more often than not, we want to keep betting our value combos regardless of our opponent's strategy, and we sort of deviate with the other parts of our range as the exploit. Next, when villain overfolds, we should increase our betting frequency by a lot, actually, relative to the increase in our opponent's folding frequency. Similarly, when villain check raises less often than GTO, we should also increase our betting frequency because we are more likely to both push and deny equity with all of our combos that we can bet. When villain check raises more often than GTO, there is some more nuance here. We should check back more often if their optimal check raise frequency is already low, but we should bet more often if they are already supposed to be raising with all or most of their strong hands on the flop, which we sort of saw in that 8-8 deuce example. And finally, when our opponent does not donk bet as much as they should, we should dramatically increase our checking frequency. So we should pure check on boards where we rarely or never have straights and big blind has a decent amount of them and never donk bets. And on other boards, we should still pretty dramatically reduce our betting frequency, again, when our opponent should have a donking range, but rarely or never actually donk bets. So sort of to wrap things up, we don't need to completely reinvent our strategy every time we have a read, but when we know that someone is overfolding, under check raising, or failing to donk bet in spots where they should, those tendencies can create pretty clear incentives for us to adjust. So hopefully this has given you a good starting point for thinking about adjusting flop c-betting based on your opponent's tendencies instead of sort of autopiloting your flop strategy. If you found this useful, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.